She laughed and said, "You're too average to ever be successful in life." I didn't respond and focused on myself. Months later, she sat across from me in a meeting and realized I was the one approving her contract terms. "You're too average to ever be successful in life." She said it with a laugh. Not the kind of laugh that warms up a room, the kind that sharpens one, like a blade folded inside silk. I was standing in the kitchen holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. The overhead light above the counter buzzed faintly. The refrigerator hummed the way refrigerators do in quiet apartments. Constant, unaware, not caring that the room had just changed. And I stood there in the ordinary noise of an ordinary Tuesday evening, holding this moment that was quickly becoming anything but ordinary. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or lower my eyes or reach for some version of myself that could match her energy. I didn't scramble for a comeback. I didn't try to be clever. I just stood there, mug in both hands, and let her words settle in the air between us like smoke. Thick, visible, impossible to ignore, and I made the decision not to fan the flame. She must have expected something. A defense. Some version of me suddenly animated, listing my credentials and my plans and my potential, making a case for myself like I was on trial, and she was the only judge who mattered. But I gave her silence. Clean, deliberate, unshaken silence. And that silence, that single, invisible, unglamorous decision in a kitchen at the end of a Tuesday, turned out to be the single most powerful thing I had done in years. Because about 11 months after that night, she walked through a set of frosted glass doors on the 14th floor of an office building downtown. She was wearing a navy blazer, presentation folder tucked under one arm. The particular posture of someone who has walked into a lot of rooms and has learned to walk in like they own the pace of the place. She sat down across a long conference table from me. She arranged her materials with both hands. She adjusted the collar of her jacket. A small, composed gesture, the kind that buys you a half second to settle. And then she looked up. The way you look up when you're about to begin a conversation you believe you have the upper hand in. And the moment her eyes landed on mine, the expression on her face did something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It didn't shatter. It didn't crumble into something obvious and dramatic. It dissolved, the way morning frost dissolves on glass when the sun finally clears the edge of the building, slowly, from the inside out, leaving something underneath that was raw and unguarded and very difficult to hide. I held her gaze for exactly the right amount of time. Professional, level, giving nothing. And then I looked back down at my notes. The meeting began. What she didn't know that night, what she couldn't have known, was that earlier that same evening, I had received a phone call. The kind that doesn't announce itself as significant. It just comes, changes the internal landscape of your life, and hangs up. I had been offered a senior-level position at the firm, a role I had worked toward for almost 3 years. One I had applied for twice before, been passed over twice before, and had spent time convincing myself wasn't meant for me, only to quietly try again, differently, better prepared. I was going to tell her when I got home. I had thought about it on the commute back. Not rehearsed exactly, imagined. The way you let yourself imagine something before it's real, walking it forward in your head. I thought she would be the first person I told. The person I called when I stepped out of the call. The person I'd open something nice with and sit on the couch with, and actually talk to about the future. The way we had talked about the future back when things between us still had that quality of warmth and direction. Instead, I walked through the door into a conversation that had started without me. Something about her day. A client who had gone cold on a deal she'd been nursing for 6 weeks. A colleague who had taken credit for her strategy in a team call. Legitimate frustrations. Real ones, probably. I listened. I made the right sounds. And somewhere in the next 10 minutes, without a clear hinge point I could identify, the subject had shifted. Not dramatically. It just moved. The way conversations move when someone has something they've been sitting with. Until we were no longer talking about her day. We were talking about me. My job. The pace of my career relative to hers. The gap she had apparently been clocking between where she was and where I wasn't. She was not shouting. She was not being cruel in the deliberate, purposeful way. She was speaking casually, the way people speak when they think they're just stating the obvious. Glass of wine in hand, leaning against the counter, almost bored with the certainty of it. And then she laughed. And she said it. "You're too average to ever be successful in life." I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. Not just what I did the next morning. Not just the months that followed. Who I decided, quietly and with great finality, to become. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 29 at the time. We'd been together for 2 years, well past the still discovering everything phase, a few months shy of what I had imagined might be the next chapter. I worked in corporate procurement at a mid-sized firm. Vendor management, contract negotiations, supplier relationships, cost analysis. She, Brooke, worked in enterprise sales for one of the vendor companies our firm occasionally partnered with. That's the full picture you need for now. Everything else reveals itself as we go. The morning after, I woke before the alarm, before the light. The apartment was dark, she was still asleep, and I lay on my back staring at the ceiling doing the kind of thinking that only happens in the specific silence of 4:50 in the morning. I want to be honest with you about what I was actually thinking. Because the easy version of this, the version people want to hear, would have me lying there burning, wounded, vowing revenge on someone who had underestimated me. But that wasn't it. What was actually happening was more uncomfortable. I was asking myself if she had a point. Not the cruelty of the delivery. Not the laugh. The substance. Was I moving with urgency? Was I building something real and deliberate? Or had I, somewhere in the last year or two, settled into a comfortable, unhurried pace that I had been telling myself was steady, but was actually just still? I lay there for a long time with that question, and the answer I came back with was honest. Partially. I had been coasting. Not failing. Not going backward. But not surging forward, either. And she had looked at that comfortable, unambitious, quiet pace, and decided it was a permanent state. A fixed category. A conclusion she had reached about who I fundamentally was. What she didn't account for, what almost nobody accounts for when they assign permanent labels to people, is the decision. The quiet, invisible, 5 a.m. decision a person makes when no one else is watching. The decision to stop being what someone else expects and start being what you actually are. I got out of bed. I didn't wake her. I made coffee, real coffee, hot this time, and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open in the dark. And I accepted the job offer. I hadn't told her about the call. Not that night, and not the morning after. And sitting there in the kitchen quiet, I noticed something that I hadn't let myself see clearly before. I didn't want to tell her. Not out of spite. Out of something older and more instinctive. The sense that what I was now holding, this new opportunity, this new direction, needed to be kept somewhere safe while it was still forming. And she wasn't a safe place for new things right now. I thought about the last 6 months. The way she'd go quiet when I talked about something I was working toward. The way conversations about my goals would somehow migrate, naturally, smoothly, like water finding a lower level, back toward hers. The offhand comments wrapped in humor. Offhand comments are always wrapped in humor. About my salary relative to hers. About the pace of my title progression. About the stability of my role. The word stability delivered in a way that was meant to sound neutral, but landed like something smaller. I had filed every single one of those moments away under she's venting, or she's competitive. It doesn't mean anything, or I'm reading too much into tone. But the night before, something had been said plainly, unambiguously, laughed at, and I couldn't file that one. So I sat with all of them at once. And I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront. I wasn't going to fight. I wasn't going to give any of this the oxygen of a scene. I was going to move. Quietly. Deliberately. Without announcement. 3 weeks later, the new role started. The evening before my first day, I told Brooke. Brief. Factual. I accepted a new position. Senior procurement strategist. I start tomorrow. She set down her fork. The pause had weight in it. When did this happen? A few weeks ago. A few weeks. Not a question. A repetition with something underneath it. And you didn't say anything? No. Why not? I considered how to answer honestly. I needed time with it first, I said. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully interpret. Something that was not quite hurt and not quite surprised. Somewhere in the complicated space between the two. She didn't push further. And that unusual restraint, that pulling back where she would once have pushed forward, told me something too. She could feel the shift, even without it being named. The new role was bigger and more complex than anything I had handled before. My manager was a man named Qley. Precise, economical with words, the kind of thinker who makes you want to sharpen every thought before you bring it into the room. He had been running procurement strategy for 7 years. His reputation was divided, either the best or the hardest person to work under, depending on who you asked. Within 2 weeks, I had concluded that both versions were correct and neither one was a problem. I arrived early, not for the optics of it, The work genuinely required it. There was a significant volume of context to absorb, vendor relationships with years of history baked into them, contract structures built in layers, each layer making more sense once you understood the one beneath it. I spent the first 4 weeks mostly reading, reviewing, mapping, building the kind of internal picture of a portfolio that you can only build by sitting with the detail long enough that it stops feeling like data and starts feeling like a landscape. Callum noticed. He didn't comment. He wasn't a man who commented. But there's a specific kind of attention that comes from someone operating at a certain level, an orientation in your direction that isn't quite watching but is definitely registering. 6 weeks in, he called me in after a strategy session. Closed the door. "You flagged the Westbridge renewal clause," he said. "Yes," I said. "The volume commitment threshold in the renewal terms, 15% increase over the next 2 years. Based on our revised projections and the softness we're projecting in Q3, that clause creates exposure we don't have in the current contract." He looked at me, the specific look of someone confirming something they had already suspected. "You're the first person in this department to catch that before it reached legal," he said. He closed the folder. "Going forward, I want you in the full vendor review cycle. Access to everything." I nodded, kept my expression even, walked back to my desk, and sat there for a moment in the particular, quiet electricity of a door that has finally swung open inward. At home, things had gone to a different kind of quiet. Brooke and I were still in the same apartment, still functionally together, still sharing meals and the same side of the bed and the ordinary logistics of 2 people in the same space. But beneath the functional surface, something structural had shifted, like a wall neither of us had built deliberately, but both of us had stopped trying to take down. She had stopped asking about work in the curious, interested way she once had. I had stopped volunteering. There were evenings where we sat across from each other, and the quiet between us was not the comfortable quiet of 2 people who don't need words. It was the quiet of 2 people who had run out of the words that actually mattered and hadn't yet admitted it. I was changing, not dramatically, not in a way anyone watching from the outside would have noticed in the first weeks, but in the slower, more fundamental way that happens when you finally give your energy to something that deserves it. I was waking up earlier, running in the mornings, which sounds like a footnote, but for me represented the first physical discipline I had built and genuinely kept since my mid-20s. I was reading differently, with a different quality of focus. I was thinking in longer arcs, making decisions more deliberately, spending less time second-guessing. And Brooke, in a handful of conversations that still had real content in them, would sometimes look at me with an expression I couldn't fully decode, like she was trying to reconcile what she was looking at now with the version she had filed away. Like the categories weren't mapping cleanly anymore. I noticed it. I didn't comment on it. I kept moving. It was around the 4-month mark when things at the firm began to accelerate. The company was mid-expansion, new divisions, revised budget allocations, a planned restructure of the full procurement and vendor management pipeline. Callum was being promoted, moving into a broader leadership scope, and he was asking me to take over a significant portion of his current portfolio. That meant full responsibility for a set of major vendor accounts, contract negotiations from the ground up, renewal decisions, approval authority on deals up to a defined dollar threshold. The conversation was brief, the way important conversations with Callum always were. He said what he was offering. He said what he expected. He extended his hand. And just like that, I was the one sitting on the other side, the one holding the pen, the one vendors needed to make their case to. I went home that evening and stood in the kitchen. I stood there for a long time, not thinking about the role, specifically, thinking about the kitchen, about how many times I had stood in almost this exact spot, this particular combination of refrigerator hum and overhead light and countertop and night coming in through the window, and how different the feeling was now from the last time this room had mattered. Months ago, I had stood here holding cold coffee and said nothing, and the silence I had given that moment had turned into something I hadn't anticipated. Not anger that hardened into discipline, not spite that sharpened into focus. Something cleaner than both of those. Purpose. The specific, quiet, directed energy of a person who has finally stopped spending themselves on being seen a certain way and started spending themselves on being something certain. Around this same period, I found something in the portfolio data that changed the tone of my standing in the firm almost overnight. A supplier overlap. 2 separate contracts, billed independently, covering virtually the same service category. Nobody had cross-referenced them because nobody had been looking across the full portfolio at once. Everyone was managing their piece. The combined redundancy cost was significant, not a rounding error, not a footnote. A real number with real implications. When I brought the full analysis to Callum, laid out clearly and specifically, he went quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "How did this not surface before?" he said. "Nobody was looking at the full picture simultaneously," I said. "The accounts were managed separately, and the overlap was only visible when you cross-referenced the service scope descriptions, which weren't standardized in the legacy system." He looked at the document in his hand. "You were looking at the full picture. That's what you asked me to do," I said. He set the paper down. "It is," he said. And then he did something rare. He smiled. For Callum, that was roughly equivalent to a standing ovation from anyone else in the building. The findings went to the executive team. My name was on every page. And after that, the kind of conversations I was being included in changed. Not gradually, noticeably. The breakup, when it came, was not dramatic. It arrived slowly, the way tides arrive, the water moving further and further from where it used to be, until one day you look out and the distance is undeniable. It was a Sunday. She was on the couch with her coffee. I was near the window, and we had a conversation, slow, honest, quiet, that said everything that had been sitting between us for months in the shape of silence. She said I had become distant, unreachable in some interior way she couldn't name specifically, but felt constantly. That living with me had started to feel like living with someone who was elsewhere. I listened to all of it without interrupting. Then I told her the truth, not to hurt her, but because she deserved honesty, and I was done performing things I didn't feel. I told her that something in me had shifted, something that had nothing to do with whether she was a good person. She was, and nothing to do with a specific moment of falling out of love. It was more like, I had finally found the direction I was meant to move in, and I needed to move in it with everything I had. And I couldn't do that and be fully present in a relationship that had quietly become the thing I was managing around. She looked at the table for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "I know," she said. 2 words. Carrying everything. We separated without spectacle, without the performances people sometimes put on to make a breakup feel significant from the outside. She moved her things over a weekend. The apartment went quiet in a new way. And after about 3 days, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like room. I want to stop here and tell you something I left out earlier. Something I mentioned briefly, almost in passing, but didn't explain. Brooke worked in enterprise sales for a vendor company, a company that my firm occasionally partnered with. I mentioned that at the start. What I didn't tell you is which vendor company. There are dozens of active vendors in a procurement portfolio at any given time. You manage them through numbers and metrics and contract terms. You don't always cross-reference names against your personal history. And when you're moving at the pace I was moving at, absorbed in the work, building the scope, preparing for a major consolidation project, you don't pause on every vendor name to do personal archaeology. I should have paused on one, but I didn't. Not until the morning of the meeting. The cross-departmental vendor consolidation project was the most complex initiative I had been handed. Multi-vendor, politically sensitive, high visibility. The kind of project where the right result makes your career legible in a new way, and the wrong handling makes it quietly complicated. I wasn't nervous. I was focused. The review cycle was a series of structured meetings, each shortlisted vendor presenting their proposal, our team assessing and countering, the process moving methodically toward a set of decisions. I had reviewed the full vendor list the week before, cross-referenced against contract history, performance data, pricing benchmarks, flagged 2 vendors as high priority for renegotiation. One of them was listed as Greystone Consulting Solutions. I noted the name, made the relevant annotation, moved to the next item. I did not stop. I did not pause. I did not make any connection at all. Not until the Thursday morning when I walked into the 14th floor conference room and began setting up for the Greystone meeting. And something about the name, combined with some background detail I had pulled into the brief that morning, produced a quiet flicker of recognition. I sat with it for a moment. Then Priya came in. Then Owen. Then the frosted glass doors opened. And I didn't need the recognition anymore, because she was standing in the room. Brooke was looking down at her folder when she came through the door. She sat down across from Priya. Then she looked up. There is a specific moment, a fraction of a second, when 2 people recognize each other in a context where recognition is the last thing either one had mapped. It's like watching a collision happen slowly enough that you can see both sides absorb the impact. That moment happened. And then, almost immediately, the professional training kicked in. hers mine, and both of us smoothed our expressions and became the people we were there to be. I extended my hand to Garrett first. Firm. Unhurried. Good morning. I appreciate you both making the time. Then I looked at Brooke. Same tone. Same level expression. Good morning. She shook my hand. Her grip was steady. I'll give her that. Her face was composed. But her eyes, behind all that professional steadiness, were doing something that couldn't quite be fully contained. The rapid, urgent work of recalibration. The look of someone trying to reconcile the version of a person they stored in memory with the person sitting across from them in a director's chair. We sat down. The meeting began. Garrett opened their presentation. Smooth. Professional. Hitting all the expected notes about service record and scalability and commitment to long-term partnership. He was good at this. Then Brooke took over the contract-specific section. And here's something I want to say honestly, because I think it matters. She was good. She moved through the material with real fluency and command. She knew the numbers. She handled the structure of the proposal clearly and with genuine authority. I watched her work and thought, in some separate, non-professional compartment of my mind, that she had always been genuinely sharp at what she did. That had never been in question. She caught herself once, mid-sentence, gesturing toward a chart on the screen, and her eyes cut briefly to me. I was writing in my notebook. I did not look up. She continued. When they finished, I let a beat of quiet sit before I spoke. Thank you. Strong presentation. I turned to the relevant page. On page 9, section 4. The exclusivity clause. I want to walk through the 18-month lock-in period. Help me understand the rationale. Garrett looked at Brooke. Brooke looked at the page. The lock-in is structured to protect the investment we make in custom onboarding and implementation at this tier, she said. It's standard across our enterprise agreements. I understand the rationale, I said. The challenge is that our restructuring timeline and our projected needs in the next fiscal cycle require flexibility that an 18-month exclusivity window doesn't provide. That term needs to be revisited. A pause. Controlled. That clause has been consistent across our contracts at this level for several years, she said carefully. It's not typically something we've opened for adjustment. I understand that history, I said, and I want to be direct about something. We're not interested in a rigid arrangement built around your standard terms. We're interested in a partnership structure that works for both sides on a practical level. The 18-month window doesn't get us there. I kept my voice even. Not cold. Not performing toughness. Just precise. What flexibility does Greystone have on that clause? She held my gaze. And in that moment, professional table, professional room, professional distance, I saw something move through her expression that I don't think she intended anyone at the table to see. The particular look of someone who has just registered that the room they walked into is not the room they had mapped in their head. I'll need to take that back to our senior leadership, she said. Of course, I said. We'll flag it as a primary follow-up item. I made the note. We moved forward. There were 4 more items before the session wrapped. Each one was legitimate. Each one was grounded in the data. I was not performing difficulty. I was not using the table as a stage for personal resolution. I was doing the job. But I would be lying if I told you there was nothing underneath the professionalism. Not triumph. Triumph is loud and self-conscious. This was quieter than that. The feeling of a man who had spent months building something in silence, without audience, without validation, without anyone watching, standing inside the finished structure and simply looking at what the silence had produced. It was not a small thing. We broke for 10 minutes midway through. I stepped into the corridor. She followed. I had expected this. The corridor was empty. She kept her voice low and even. I didn't know you were the lead on this account, she said. I genuinely didn't know. I know, I said. How long have you been in this role? About 8 months. She absorbed that. Did the math visibly. 8 months placed us almost precisely at the moment our relationship had started to fracture. I need you to know, she said carefully, that whatever happens in that room, I need it evaluated on the merits. On the work. Nothing else. That's the only way I operate, I said. And I meant it completely. That was never going to be the kind of man I was. I know, she said. A pause. A different kind of pause. You look different, she said. Not the way you say something you're hoping will land a certain way. The way you say something when you're looking at evidence you didn't anticipate and you haven't fully processed it yet. I'll see you back inside, I said. And I walked back through the frosted glass. The second half of the session was shorter. We finalized the list of outstanding items. 2-week timeline for Greystone's revised terms. Garrett confirmed. Brooke answered what came to her directly, took her notes, stayed composed throughout. But the specific energy she had walked in with, the ease of someone who knows the territory, had shifted, like something had been recalibrated mid-meeting and she was still orienting to the new coordinates. When it ended, handshakes around the table. Garrett said he looked forward to finalizing the partnership. I said we'd be in touch. Brooke and I didn't say anything directly to each other at the close. Just a brief, level look across the table. Then the frosted glass doors closed, and they were gone. I sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes after everyone cleared out, not processing something overwhelming, not sitting in the drama of the moment, just being still in it. There's a version of this story where that room is the whole point, where everything I did for 8 months was aimed, consciously or unconsciously, at this specific reversal. The man she called average, sitting at the head of the table. The woman who laughed, sitting across from him needing his approval. That version of the story is neater, more satisfying from the outside. But it's not true. The truth is that Brooke had barely been in my thoughts during those 8 months. Not because I was cold, and not as a performance of moving on, but because the decision I made the morning after, to stop spending energy on being seen a certain way by someone who had already decided, had a specific and real effect. It emptied my hands, and I used them. I used them to build something. Not for her, not aimed at any specific moment. For myself, toward the version of myself I had glimpsed that morning in the kitchen and decided to move toward. The conference room was not a destination. It was just a Thursday where someone who had once decided my ceiling walked into a room that I had built past it, and the building spoke for itself. Greystone's revised terms arrived 9 days later. The exclusivity clause adjusted to 9 months. 2 other flagged items restructured in ways that were workable. I reviewed the revised proposal with Owen and Priya. Line by line, we noted 2 remaining points. I drafted our final position. Clear, specific, fair. Garrett responded within a day. Accepted both points. The contract moved to legal. Done. 2 weeks after finalization, I received a message from her. Short, careful. She said she had wanted to reach out for a while before she actually did. She was glad the contract had come together. She hoped things were well. And then, at the end, in a couple of quiet sentences, she apologized for what she had said that night. She said she'd thought about it since the meeting and wanted me to know it wasn't something she had meant the way it came out. She said she understood if I wasn't interested in revisiting it. I read it twice, sat with it. Then I wrote back. Short, honest. I said I appreciated her saying that. I said I hadn't carried it with me. I said I hoped things were going well for her too. And I meant every word. Because the actual, unglamorous truth was, I really hadn't been carrying it. The night she said it, something in me had made a quiet decision to set it down. And I had spent the last 8 months building with both hands free. I had no room for grudges. I had things to build. A month later, Callum sat across from me in his office. He was moving up. A new role opening for Director of Vendor Strategy, full oversight of the function. You're the first conversation I'm having about this position, he said. Is this something you want, he asked. Not, do you think you're ready? Not, here's what we'd expect from you. Just, do you want it? Because he already knew everything else. Yes, I said. No hesitation. No performance of humility. Just the clean answer of someone who had finally learned to stop hedging before the things he actually wanted. First morning as director. I arrived early. Same as always. Made coffee. Sat at the desk. Different view. Same building. And looked out at the downtown corridor as the city filled in below. The light was coming through at an angle that made the glass towers across the street look briefly gold. Then the angle shifted, and they were just buildings again. I sat there for a few quiet minutes before the day started. Not celebrating. Not narrating. Just present. In the particular quiet of a morning that is the first of something. And I thought about that kitchen. The buzzing light. The cold coffee. The laugh. The silence I chose. I didn't think about it with anger. I didn't think about it with pride, exactly. I thought about it the way you think about a crossroads you pass through without fully knowing it, with the kind of recognition that comes only after you've walked far enough forward to look back and see the shape of the fork. I had stood in that kitchen and made the smallest, quietest, most invisible choice. To be still. To not react. To not give the moment the heat it was designed to pull from me. And the stillness had turned into something. Not because stillness is always the answer, but because in that specific moment, it was the right one. It freed up everything. There's something I want to say before I finish. Because I think this story is about more than a job title or a conference room. Or a woman who said something unkind and eventually had to sit across a table from the man she'd said it to. I think it's about energy. Where you put it. What comes back when you finally stop wasting it on the wrong places? There is a particular weight, and I know you know this weight. Most people do. That comes from meeting someone who has underestimated you to revise their estimate. The constant low-grade effort of proving yourself to a person who has already decided. The way you shape your conversations, your updates, your small victories, around the hope that this time they'll see it. That weight is not small, and it takes up both hands. The night she laughed and called me average, something in me recognized, maybe for the first time clearly, how long I had been carrying that weight. Not just in this relationship. In general, the weight of performing for people who were not actually watching, of building toward other people's definitions of success instead of my own. And I set it down. Not dramatically, not with a declaration. In a kitchen at the end of a Tuesday. Just set it down. Walked away from it. And the next morning, with both hands empty, started building the thing I had always actually meant to build. She called me too average to ever be successful. I gave her nothing. I woke up early the next morning, made coffee, opened the laptop, and started. The conference room was just where she finally caught up.